Around 1986, a toddler-sized talking doll, whose name I'm still too superstitious to repeat, hit the market. She had blonde, curly ringlets and large blue eyes that moved around when she talked. The sound she made came from a cassette player that was built into her back, and her rubber mouth would open and close along with the audio. The first time that I saw one of these dolls in person was at a friend's house. For the next year, I would persistently beg my parents for that doll, and when I was 8, they surprised me with one for my birthday. Between 88 and 89, the doll and I got along well. I started to outgrow the cutesy and babyish cassettes that came with her, so sometimes I would put random tapes in her back, even music. I would laugh hysterically as her mouth and eyes moved along with from everything from classical to my dad's boring financial tutorials, narrated by this droning male voice. That man's voice emanated from the doll's mouth, and it looked totally creepy, but even more hilarious. I inevitably got bored, but for at least a year, I had some good times. It was towards the end of my 4th grade school year in 1989, and one night, I was getting ready for bed, like I always did. This night was marked by a gradual uneasiness, which started out as barely noticeable, but by the time I was in bed, I began to worry that I may never get to sleep. It was odd too because there was nothing in particular that I was anticipating, or that was bothering me. No class trips, no tests, pop quizzes, nothing. Nothing that might trigger a sleepless night. I wondered if I was coming down with something. I was feeling ever so slightly unwell, and the sensations in my body were causing me a great deal of anxiety. I lay with this discomfort for at least 2 hours, wanting to toss and turn, but felt too emotionally paralyzed to move. For some reason, I wanted to face the wall. In fact, I was afraid to face the open space of my room. A sense of dread had emerged. I remembered what my mother had told me about not being able to sleep. She recommended that I didn't force myself to close my eyes, so I left them open. Periodically, my eyelids would close, but then my awareness of them closing would wake me up. Another hour went by, and I was used to hearing the occasional whirring of cars. But after laying awake for so long, the traffic noise gradually ceased. The quietness of the room was distracting. Judging by the lack of street noise, I'm guessing that it was easily 3 or 4 in the morning. Then, I heard something impossibly bizarre and just barely audible. My baby brother's crib was across the room by the window. He was not yet talking, more than maybe a couple of words, and certainly wasn't counting. But I heard him not just counting, but doing it backwards from 10. Every number was spoken in an exaggeratedly drawn-out sing-song voice that started from a lower pitch and eventually made its way up higher. I peeked quickly over my shoulder to look at the crib, but it looked like my brother was asleep. 10, 9, 8, 7. I pulled the covers tightly around my body, trying to convince myself that I didn't hear what I was hearing. After all, the volume of that tiny voice was extremely low. Perhaps the baby was babbling in his sleep and my brain was trying to make sense of it. Could I have dozed off? Well, that's the thing. I had been awake the entire night. 5, 4, etc. Then, a faint clicking sound came from the corner beside my brother's crib. There, a small wooden chair in that corner. Each of its legs had a metal wheel, which clicked in such a way when the chair was being moved. It was unmistakable. The chair was moving on its own. I didn't dare turn to look, because I was depending on the last ounce of denial that I could possibly muster. The worst thing about this chair, other than its sudden independent movement, was that it was the permanent residence of the doll when it was not in use. I knew she was sitting on the chair before I got into bed. Then, It felt as though all the air had been sucked out of the room, and I could hear the clicking of the chair's wheels as they inched closer and closer to my bed. I tried calling out for my parents, but I wasn't able to yell loudly enough. The fear was so intense that I could barely move. But eventually, I decided that I should just yell or try to make a run for the door. The problem here was that in order to get out of the room, I would have to risk looking at the doll. Finally, I was able to move a little. That's when I made the mistake of turning my head too far around and saw the doll in her chair inches away from my bed. What's even worse is that her face was contorted in such a way that even I as an adult can compare to Regan from The Exorcist. But as a 9-year-old, I had no concept of that. The doll's eyes were looking upward, but slightly to one corner, creating an absolutely horrifying image that I will never forget. That's when I let out this powerful shriek. I did so reflexively, and it almost like I was listening to somebody else's scream. When my parents come running in, the doll was back in her corner, and, of course, I was never believed. I slept in my parents' bed, and, of course, they were angry. So, I dreamed I was in a car, driving in circles around some suburban neighborhood that I had never seen before. Living alone with the aftermath of this experience was traumatic in and of itself. The following week, I was so paranoid about seeing inanimate objects doing things they weren't supposed to do that I jumped to conclusions about certain things. For instance, the shampoo and conditioner that was in the shower one evening felt significantly heavier than they did earlier in the day. I was afraid that somehow the substances would materialize at will. My mom just insisted that water probably got in the bottles, but it hadn't. I turned the bottles over. No excess water came out. Perhaps it was my paranoia, but I'm not ruling anything out. Not after what I experienced. It actually took several months to feel somewhat normal again. And even to this day as an adult, as I am writing this story of mine to you, I am still affected by this incident. When my grandma was alive, years ago, she shared this with me. One morning, around 5 a.m., she was standing in the kitchen, washing dishes. My grandfather was still asleep, as the hours were earlier than his usual wake-up time. There is a window above the kitchen sink, and it looks out into the back patio. When it's too dark to see outside, the kitchen light is bright enough that you can clearly see the refrigerator and the reflection of the window. The kitchen suddenly feels cold. Now, keep in mind, we live in Hawaii, where the temperature is consistently in the high 60s to mid 70s most mornings. My grandma found it strange that the temperature seemed to have dropped abruptly, said it felt like the freezer door was open. She sees movement in the reflection of the window, which catches her eye. She slowly looks up to the window and sees the silhouette of a figure behind her. She is startled by this, since no noise was made. That includes footsteps, no door sounds, nothing. But she wasn't afraid. Startled, yes. She quickly drops the dishes, spins around to face the unknown visitor. She then realizes she recognizes the visitor. The figure slowly walked past the fridge without acknowledging my grandmother, not even making eye contact. It then made a right turn directly into the kitchen closet, where it just dissipated into nothingness. Now, my grandma's head is spinning because she had just seen her mother. Her mother, who she last saw in Germany, where her and her family are from. Her mother, whom she hadn't seen in decades. Her mother, who had passed away many years ago. My grandmother hasn't had any experiences as far as visual encounters, but would swear up and down that she would often feel her father in the house, mostly when she would be getting ready for bed. Her and her father were very close, as she was supposedly his favorite out of all their siblings. Her father also was enlisted in the German army. They hated the Nazis. She would even remember having to hide in the attic during the war. Anyway, my grandmother says that when she was a little girl, her father would tickle her feet when tucking her in at night. After she moved to Hawaii, with my grandfather and her father passed away. I'm sure you can guess where I'm going with this. She recalled numerous nights of feeling her father's presence and his hands tickling her feet. She would expose them from under her covers. She was never afraid and in her heart knew this was him. This thoroughly creeped me out, and for this reason, I can never sleep with my feet hanging out, even to this day. Oh, and my Aunt Tammy has had this paranormal experience for as long as she can remember. For some odd reason, she has always been extremely sensitive to the paranormal. In fact, years ago, she and her kids, or my cousins Shanielle and Derek, lived in a very old plantation house that had been previously owned by one of the sugarcane workers. He was an old man that had a pretty bad alcohol problem, and from what they were told, he had apparently hung himself in the backyard on a mango tree that was still there when they moved in. The house always had a very eerie vibe, no matter the time of day. Actually, I visited tons of times myself to go hang out with them, and just never felt comfortable there. I didn't know of the happenings going on at that age, so all the feelings were just whatever to me. It just always felt sort of dark, like something was going to happen. It was a small, aged 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom creaky house with old wooden floors. Everything that had a door would make noise. You couldn't take a step in that house without making a sound. Tammy was home alone one night, and the kids were sleeping over at a relative's, so she was enjoying the quiet time all to herself. She gets up from the couch in the living room, where she was watching TV, to get her scented lotion, and she had swore that she had left it on the kitchen table. After scouring the area all around the table and kitchen counters, she heads into her bedroom. Having no luck in there, or the bathroom, she gives up, walks back into the kitchen. She stopped dead in her tracks and scanned the entire kitchen in awe. Every single cupboard and drawer were wide open. Confused and freaked out, she began to close them, when out of the corner of her eye, she spots something on the kitchen table. It was the bottle of lotion that she had been looking for. She questioned all of how this happened when she hadn't heard a single noise while in her bedroom. As mentioned earlier, the house was old and noisy, so sneaking around was out of the question. Now, Derek would often complain to Auntie Tammy that he always felt watched in his own house. He was 7 years of age, so no child typically has the feeling of ever being known of being watched just out of the blue. He would tell her that he hated showering, and this only happened in that house. She would have to hang out with him in the bathroom, talk to him while he showered. He just couldn't do it. He was genuinely horrified. Derek had his own set of experiences living in that house. He would be asleep in his room and wake up scared out of his mind because he would hear breathing and he felt the hot breath of someone or something behind him. He would get up and see there was nobody there but him. If his sleep wasn't interrupted by ghostly breathing, it would be heavy boot steps. The floorboards would creak, in addition to what seemed like boots, slowly making their way to his open door, then stopping once they reached his room. He would stare out into the hall from his bed, expecting to see somebody, but never did. My parents lived in that old plantation house for a few months before myself or my cousins were born. They needed a temporary place to stay. My parents were the only two in the house one night, and they needed to jump in their car and go run an errand or something. My dad gets up, accidentally drops the car keys behind the bed. Hearing them hit the floor, he moved the bed to pick them up. My dad made a puzzled expression, and my mom asked what the problem was. He pulled the bed to the other side of the room to make sure it wasn't caught by one of the legs and asked, "Where did they go?" My mom looked on the floor, where they both knew for certain the key should have been, and was just as equally confused. They flipped the entire mattress, took the sheets, blankets off, comforters off, shook them out, still couldn't find the keys. Double-checking their pockets, shirts, everywhere in the room. Now they are frustrated because there's no doubt the keys were in his hand and should have been on the floor where they had heard them drop. Now they're out of ideas. So they went to check around the house, again, knowing well it couldn't have been anywhere but in that room. After a half an hour or so later, they gave up on the search, walked back to the room to recognize the mess they had made. Sitting on the naked mattress, which was hanging halfway off the bed, were the missing keys. My parents lost their minds and were so shaken by this, they left the messy room as it was, grabbed the keys, and slept at a friend's house for the night. Now, my Aunt Tammy is currently living in a rented house on a very nice piece of land, about 20 minutes from where I live. She says she loves the place, and it is the perfect size for her and her off-and-on boyfriend. The house does have character, however. Several months ago, she was alone in the house, in the living room. My cousin had been over and had just left a few minutes prior. She suddenly hears something light and metallic sounding moving on top of her table. She quickly looks for the noise, sees movement. It was the lampshade, lifting up a couple of inches higher than the light bulb. As soon as she gasps, the lampshade drops back into place, making an even louder noise. She gets up, inspects it. She confirms that she wasn't just imagining things, because the lampshade was now crooked and had to be readjusted to its correct position. Just a few months later, in the same house, my Aunt Tammy had an extra bedroom that she was renting to our cousin. Their rooms are on the opposite sides of the fairly big house, so they rarely run into each other. One night, my aunt was alone in bed, just about to fall asleep, when she hears a loud force hit her door, as if somebody punched it as hard as they could with their fist. She jumps out of bed, runs to her door, swinging it open. There was nobody there, so she stepped into the living room, inspected the rest of the house. It was quiet, and everything seemed to be in its place. She noticed the room door was closed, so there was no way he could have hit her door, ran back to his room, shut the door, at least without ever being seen or heard. She went back to bed and eventually fell asleep, wondering if she could have imagined it. The next day, he approached her. "Hey, I was going to ask you, did you hear that loud bang last night?" That confirmed it. She definitely did not imagine it. I know this has been long, but these are only some of my paranormal experiences that my entire family members have had. Anyway, I was completely on edge while writing all this out because I've seen their faces when they explained their own experiences to me. I've seen how uneasy most of them were, just talking about it. I'm happy that I have never experienced these things myself and hope it stays that way.